Introducing Joanne Alcantara, our speaker today. We're really pleased to have her. She is a nonprofit consultant. She has worked on issues of gender-based violence for over 20 years, touching issues of reproductive freedom, third world feminism, domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. Joanne has served as a researcher, fundraiser, finance lead, board member, and executive director in her work in the nonprofit arena. So welcome, Joanne, and we're really pleased to have you with us today. Thank you so much. This is such a very important topic. I wish it wasn't, but the reality is it is. So thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here with everybody, and I'm hoping that in our time together we can get to know each other a little bit better. I do have some check-in and intro questions that I was planning in the presentation, so I'm hoping folks will participate and and just share in the conversation together. It sounds like you've had really great topics already this year, and that the Social Justice Committee is really committed to learning and growing and really deepening your connection between your faith and your work in the world. And that's always so beautiful. So thank you for that. And thank you for inviting me. I'm starting with just this first slide here of a vigil that happened in Seattle. Some of you may have heard about it. It was organized by the Massage Parlor Outreach Project, which is part of it's a grassroots organization that's been in partnership with API Chaya, one of my home organizations. And this was a list of the women and the massage parlor workers who were killed in the Atlanta shootings that happened earlier this year in March. And from what I understand, this is part of why folks wanted to invite me this fall to talk a little bit more, was some knowledge about these shootings, and then also an understanding that anti-Asian violence has been on the rise in the pandemic and this year. So I just wanted to start with a brief moment of silence for these workers who were killed before we start our presentation. Thank you. And our group agreements for today, you may already have some as a social justice group, but I thought, it's always helpful just to have a sense of what to expect from each other. So for me, when I enter a learning space, I just like to acknowledge that we're here to learn together. Mistakes are okay. And I hope we can approach each other with kindness and compassion as we learn from one another and as we open ourselves to new perspectives, that we can approach with humility in this space and be mindful that there are many voices here, that we can step forward and step back. So if we're noticing that we're using a lot of the time with our own voice, that we can kind of self-select to give other people a chance to speak forward. And if you're noticing that you're wanting to say something, but you've been holding back, to give yourself that freedom to please share and be part of the conversation. I invite people to be on their growing edge. So there might be some places that feel uncomfortable or that might not be an easy thing to swallow or to consider. And I just invite you to be in that place of discomfort together. And hopefully we can work towards a place of understanding. And then when this is over, I'm hopeful that folks will share any content they felt was very helpful. But if there are personal stories that individuals share about things that they've experienced, that those stay with the group and that we honor each other's privacy and confidentiality, but that we do share the content that we've learned. Is there anything that anyone would like to add, or are there any group norms that you all would like to share with me about the Social Justice Committee? Jerry, are you trying to share? Okay.
I'm here. Yes.
I wanted to, um, it's both the Adult Education Committee and the Social Justice Committee. And no, you're doing well. You're hitting all the marks that we would want you to do. So you're well within what we'd like presented. So thank you so far.
Great, thank you. And Jerry, was there something you wanted to say?
Oh, no, not at this point. I agree with Jill that I'm glad you have, those are very good guidelines for our group. And yeah, the Adult Education Committee works closely with the Social Justice Committee. So I'm sure there are some Social Justice Committee members here today. So.
Oh, my mistake. I think Hiroko's always just been telling me about the Social Justice Committee. So thank you so much.
It's both. It's both. You're perfectly good. Everything is good. It's just right. Just right.
Great. So, I'd love to get to know you all a little bit too as we open up, and if folks could take a turn to just share your name, if you have any access needs, meaning if there's anything that you need for our time together that would make it a better conversation for you, anything that is bringing you joy these days. We're in this long stretch of pandemic, and I always like to kind of check in and hear what is making people happy. And then
you could do one thing is put in the closed captioning.
Oh, sure, thank you. Jerry, is that something that you can do?
If he's host, you've got to make him host.
Okay, I am host. So Jill, how do I do the captioning or
I don't know that I can tell you.
Of course, I can make you host, and you could do it if you want.
Right now, it's come on. It's come on. It says live. It's closed caption has been enabled, so it's enabled.
Oh, okay, good.
So people just have to touch it, and it'll be good.
Okay, and I can see everyone right now. Can you raise your hand if you need help with that, or give me a thumbs up if we're okay to move forward?
Thumbs up. You're able to move forward.
Great, thanks. And then, if you could share with me, what are your hopes for our time together? And sometimes I like to think about this in terms of mind, heart, and body. Is there something that you hope to learn, something you hope to feel, something you hope to be ready to do when we conclude our time? And yeah, and I can start. So my name is Joanne. I use she, her pronouns. My access needs are met. I'm really happy to be here. Something that's bringing me joy in this time are, I have young children, and they're really goofy and silly. So being with them, brings me joy. And one of my hopes for our time is that I can learn a little bit more about your work and ways that we can connect and plug in for the future. And I'm gonna pass it to Jill.
Me?
I think she said Jill. I don't know.
Jill. All right.
But look, we can, if people don't want to do this, also they can not do it. I think it's pretty good. I did not, we're such a smaller group that people almost can be unmuted and ask questions. Also, it seems like after the end of your talk, everything's good with me. My name is Jill, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'll put it over to Ellie if you're here, and or
hi, I'm here.
Did you want to say that? And I'm thinking, could I just cut in here? I'm thinking we don't have too much access problems with this group as I'm looking down the names, but I guess I'll let you decide whether or not you want to check in. So Ellie, do you want to check in?
Yeah, I'm cooking and I'm listening. But I'm here because I want to be. And I'm happy that this subject is being discussed, especially after listening to Reverend Jessica about Thanksgiving. This is yet another piece of that we need to hear about. And so I'm glad to be here. So I'll pass it on. Jerry, you're right below me in the pecking order here.
Okay. Yes, my name's Jerry, and I'm a member of Adult Education. I'm really pleased to be here. I guess I want to have more awareness of what is happening as far as anti-Asian violence. It's a very disturbing situation to me, and but there seems to be some movement in our school systems to not talk about racial, problems and things, and so I'm alarmed by that, because I think we need to actually look at these things and bring them out in the open of inequality and injustice. So, and I'm hoping I can come away today acting with more awareness and do what I can to address the injustices that are going on. So I will hand it over to Jack Peterson. Hi, Jack, are you there? Oh, okay. Maybe he's muted. Jack, do you want to? Okay, he might be muted. I don't know.
Hi. I come these. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
I am muted my. Not on my screen. I'm not.
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. I can hear you.
No, I'm not. Not on my screen.
Yeah, I
anyway, I come to all these adult religious education. Okay, I come to these because every time I come to one, if I learn one thing, it's a good program. If I learn two things, okay. I'm telling you why I'm here then. I use the same standard I used when I was a teacher. Can you hear me or not?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Yep. Anyway.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
here to learn something, hopefully. Let's see. Rowan, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Rowan, I use she, her pronouns. Something that's bringing me joy is also the reason I'm on my phone, because my cat won't let me get up and get my computer from the other room. So always good to have
subtitles.
Little friend nearby. Yeah, especially with the censorship that we're seeing in discussing these issues in a lot of the educational systems. I think it's a really important topic to continue to discuss openly. And I'll pass it to Marty and Bill.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Marty Bishop, I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Bill Budd, and I use he, him pronouns.
And what's bringing me joy is that I get to go and see my family up on Guibas Island for Thanksgiving. And what I hope to learn, I want to become more aware of what has happened and what we can do to help make things better, to deal with white supremacy, because it's a force that has caused a lot of destruction in the world and continues to bring harm.
And I'm just hoping that I can learn more about the topic and be more aware. Pass it to Terry and Bill. Are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Bill's not, but okay. In 1976, we adopted a child who is almost 7 from Korea. He's half Korean and he's half African American. Before we adopted him, we read a book called Black and White Are Beautiful in America. And it was about a family who was, I can't remember who was, I'm she, her, by the way, who was, whether the mother or the father was Black or the mother and father was white. I can't remember which one, but they had all this, about 5 kids, and they were all different colors, and it was just so great. And I thought all this racial stuff was done with, all this prejudice was done with. And it's been very disconcerting to see that it even seems to be getting worse over the years. And I fear for my child. We did not have the knowledge to even think that there was going to be a problem. So we didn't give our child any of the cautions that, say, Black parents give their children now. And I don't know if Asian parents do that as well. We have quite a few Asian people in our neighborhood, which is great. And the two young women across the street said that they have it. This was a couple of years ago. They said they had experienced some discrimination, but it wasn't horrible, you know, like African Americans experience. So this whole thing is just totally disconcerting to me. And our son has had some mental health issues, and I'm thinking maybe some of that is due to things that have he's experienced and that he hasn't shared with us. So I am here to learn, and I hope to learn some things, and I'm just hoping that we can get our country over this. I just do not understand it. I grew up with a mother who taught us that everybody who was, well, we used the word foreign at the time, but was special. And if they spoke a language, you know, that's a different language, that's special. Or if they had an accent, that's special. And that's just, I just don't understand our world and why people are the way they are. And I feel, anyway, I'm frustrated, and I hope to learn something here, and maybe I can learn what, I don't know. I'm just here. Thank you. Thank you. And who has not spoken? I don't see. Who?
Me, Ted.
Oh, Ted. Okay, I didn't see your picture.
No, Ted. T-E-D.
Yeah. Ted. Yes, I hadn't seen your picture up there.
Okay. Well, I'm here because primarily I want to listen to the topic and learn some more. I have some friends who are Asian American who are frightened to go out into the streets because of the bias and discrimination going on. And so I'd like to, well, I'm already aware of what the problems are. I'm not sure what the solutions are, except perhaps conversation and get some enlightenment somehow, and maybe pass it on to others. So I'm here primarily out of curiosity to see what can be done, if anything, to improve our connections with folks who are not Nordic or from Central Northern European countries, because this is where I think a lot of the problems arise. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see. I think we haven't heard from Lena and Terry Mallory yet.
My name is Ellen Newberg, and
oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Something that's bringing me joy these days. I don't know if you can see him. Yeah, there he is. This is about a 10-week-old kitten, and he is just a riot. He's so much fun, and watching the relationship develop between him and that 5-year-old cat, it's just hilarious sometimes and concerning. It's concerning sometimes. We had a Japanese youth exchange student from 2010 and 11. We've stayed very close to her. We had and her family, they visited here, we visited there. We had a Taiwanese Rotary Youth Exchange student as well, and stay in touch with her. We have Franz Kosiko and Hiroko. So, this is just a concern about basically our friends, and then all other Asian people or Black or whoever. So I'm just hoping to learn more about it and more about what to do, and increase my dedication to trying to do something about it to help out. Lena.
My name is Lena, and she, her, and I'm with the people who are saying I just want to learn some more about the topic and understand more about white supremacy and how we can overcome this by learning about what other people experience. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see.
Is there anyone else that would?
Terry had not spoken, I think. I don't know.
There, sorry, I couldn't unmute. I'm Terry, she, her, and I have two teenage granddaughters, and we've done a lot of talking about Black Lives Matter, and they're extremely aware. They teach me every day, but this is not something that we have really talked much about, and I would like to be able to share some information with them and kind of expand their world a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I think, is there anybody else that hasn't? I believe that's everybody, but anybody that hasn't spoken yet that wants to?
Hello.
Hey, Jerry.
Hi. Hiroko. Hello. Hello.
Go ahead, Hiroko. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm so glad today and my experience. No, I lived in South Carolina, moved to Seattle, and South Carolina. There's a very obvious racism, and I was hoping when I go to Northwest, there are a lot of Asian population, so there's no racism, and it's a big mistake. It's more subtle, but I really suffered from racism in Seattle, and here, even UU, it's very subtle, but I can feel that, and shut me. I cannot say anything because they believe they are very against racism, all these things. Every time service, we say that. And but no one asked my experience, what I suffered from racism, or so, because I'm only one or two Asian there. So I really looking forward today to discuss about. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, coming. Yeah.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to share anything?
Not particularly. I've went over this with Hiroko, and I'd be very interested to see what you got to say. I'm sure I can pick up a few things. And I will echo some of the other folks about what's being taught in the schools. Some places are even trying to ban/burn books. That's disturbing, to say the least. And that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I can tell this is a group that, has a lot of deep empathy and care. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm really glad to be with you, and let's keep going. So, if we are seeking an Asian perspective, I think that's part of why sometimes folks get called in, right, to groups like this. I think you already know this, but Asia is a geographical location is vast. It's the largest continent and home to 60% of the world's human population. The Asian diaspora in the US is incredibly diverse in our experiences, socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnic heritage, and migratory paths. So I think, folks had mentioned, being in relationship with people in our communities that are Asian and Asian American, and my perspective today might be very different from their perspectives. And I just want to invite folks to be in really true relationship with each other, right? To learn from your neighbors, from those people who are really meaningful to you about what their experiences are, what matters to them. And from Hiroko too, someone who's right in your midst, about, you know, the things that matter and would make them feel better and more comfortable in the places that they are. For me, something to know about me is, you know, I'm coming from a perspective that US imperialism, militarism, and colonial attitudes have shaped the US relationship with Asia, Asians, Asian Americans. So I was born in the Philippines, which is a country that was colonized by the United States, as many of you probably know. And I was born to a Chinese mother and to a Filipino father in Davao, and then migrated here when I was a young child. And then in my 20s, you know, was kind of discovering a little bit more about my heritage and my background, and ended up doing community organizing with Filipinos who were trying to still, to this day, get rid of US military bases, who were looking at the impact of, you know, having US servicemen in the Philippines in terms of rape and sexual assault, and the impact on culture and the well-being of the local communities. So that's, you know, a little bit about me. I ended up in the nonprofit area, as Jerry had mentioned. So my last job before consulting was as the executive director for API Chaya. And API Chaya is an organization that serves immigrants mostly from Asian and Pacific Islander and South Asian communities who are impacted by sexual assault, by domestic violence, and by human trafficking. And of course, in that line of work, we see these intersections of how, you know, people's attitudes about Asians and Asian Americans lead to interpersonal violence, in addition to state violence. And so that's where I'm coming from. And Hiroko and I actually met when we were working together after I had, you know, maybe 20 years ago almost, in the same agency when it was a lot smaller. So I'm really happy to have done that work with Hiroko, serving survivors of violence. So this moment, the statement comes from the 2021 statement from the Seattle Asian American Film Festival. You know, there was so much brilliance that was put out after the incidences in Atlanta, and also what had happened, you know, as accumulation of the violence in the pandemic. So this is from them. Since the beginning of the pandemic, anti-Asian racism has risen exponentially. In Stop AAPI Hate's recent national report, they received reports of 3,292 incidents that occurred last year. These numbers include only reported incidents. Many of the attacks seen in headlines target some of the most vulnerable in Asian American communities, our elders and women. Although there is more awareness of anti-Asian racism, these sentiments existed long before COVID-19. And, you know, I think this group has probably heard and seen incidences from, you know, decades past up to the present. So that's part of what I want to investigate together, is that, you know, the violence that we're seeing is not new. It has new formations, but the history is really long and old, right? It's the history of colonization, it's the history of military brutality, and the attitudes that we have towards Asians and Asian Americans. Is there anything that folks would like to add while we just kind of pause for a moment to take that in? I went to the Wing Luk Asian Museum recently, and you know, I had already been asked to present to you all, and I ended up just taking some pictures there that really struck me. So I wanted to share some of these with you. And if you haven't been to the Wing Luk Asian Museum yet, it's a really wonderful experience. It's in Seattle's International District. It is free on the first Thursday of every month. So if cost is a barrier, please visit it on one of those first Thursdays. In the upstairs of the museum, there's this really amazing exhibit of, you know, Asian American history. There's a timeline and a lot of, you know, different moments that that they've curated. And I just wanted to share some of the things that struck me there. You know, this image of this mother and child during wartime, where, you know, Japanese persons were instructed to flee their homes and be evacuated. There's a long history of anti-Asian violence and riots going back, you know, to 1886, and before that, a lot of it was around labor struggles. So, you know, there were times when Asians were invited into the U.S. to do labor, and then when that labor would run out, then, you know, working class folks and you know, people who had more resources also, you know, were in a position to take out kind of their aggression and their frustration about the economic tide. And oftentimes, you know, Asian laborers were part of that taking out of that aggression. In this right-hand corner, you'll see, you know, some kind of modern images of, you know, things that are for sale that are about Asian people. So there's this mail order bride costume. I don't know if you all saw this or remember this from several years ago, but Walmart sold this costume in their stores. And, you know, for us in the movement to end violence, you know, this is a really heartbreaking piece, right? This idea in the first place that Asian women are for sale, and then secondly that it's a mockery, and that it's something that, you know, we can turn into a costume, and you know, and think that it's funny, right? We have these stamps on it that say return to sender, overnight delivery, what have you. This idea that Asian women can be bought and sold. And, you know, below you see some other kind of anti-Asian items there. There's a Chinese ghost punching puppet. There's, you know, these ways that we dehumanize each other and then, you know, try to get laughs out of it, try to make money out of it. Anyway, some of these things were at the museum, and I just wanted to share them with you. You know, there's a lot of great content. So I have a couple videos that I wanted to share. This person, the video is called The Roots of Anti-Asian Racism, kind of explores the history in the United States regarding this theme. So I'll just play it and then we can chat about it if folks have anything they want to share afterwards.
The Atlanta shooting spree that killed 6 Asian women was by no means an isolated incident. Even though it's easy to blame Trump for the rise in racial violence and harassment,
the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, Kung flu,
Asian Americans have actually suffered violence and scapegoating for many years. In fact, racism and violence against the Asian American community is as old as the US itself. To understand the root of the issue, we have to go back 236 years to 1785. That's when the first documented Chinese immigrants, 3 sailors to be exact, arrived in Maryland. Fast forward 5 years, and the Naturalization Act of 1790 was put in place to restrict citizenship for anyone who wasn't a free white person. This meant that Asian people had inferior legal status compared to white people. It's also why they couldn't own property or vote. In 1849, the California gold rush attracted hundreds of thousands of miners from around the world, including China. By 1852, over 20,000 Chinese immigrants had made San Francisco their home. Most of them were miners. But with their rapidly growing population, many Chinese Americans suffered violence and discrimination from fellow miners and also from the government. For example, California was quick to impose a foreign miners tax, which meant immigrants had to pay $3 a month for simply mining. At the time, Chinese immigrants were robbed and murdered and were set up as scapegoats for other crimes. By 1870, Chinese miners in California had contributed more than $5 million to the state through the foreign miners tax. It was almost a quarter of the state's revenue at the time. A year later, mob attacks and lynchings of Asian Americans erupted in Los Angeles. 500 white and Latino people attacked a Chinese community and killed 19 people. 17 of them were lynched. None of the killers were punished. All this tension and violence eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It's the first time in US history when Congress outlawed immigration for a specific nationality. In the years that followed, dozens of Chinese immigrants were killed in violent attacks. White mobs accused Chinese migrants of taking jobs from them. In 1900, the bubonic plague, which emerged in South Central China, hit the US with the first case recorded in San Francisco's Chinatown. Chinese Americans suffered racism and harassment with the spread of the disease.
I didn't know, there were a couple of new things on that. One about the bubonic plague, that was interesting. And the timing of all those anti-Asian laws, that was interesting to me too. What about it for you guys?
Well, you know, I think things have gotten worse during the pandemic because it was, like I said, it was a couple of years ago when I talked with my Asian neighbors about their experience as young women. And then one was just, I think before the pandemic, that there were two Muslim women outside my eye doctor's office, and they had the hijab on. And I said, would you mind if I asked you a question? And they said, oh no. And I said, well, do you experience discrimination here? And they said, not here in this area. And I don't know, it just seems like, I mean, I hope that's still true in Kitsap County, but I don't know. I don't know if it's gotten worse or what, but kind of discouraging, this whole thing. I'd like to be able to bring up I mean, I've never talked with my son about these things, and
And then in 1941, this happened.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in World War II, the US forced tens of thousands of Japanese Americans into internment camps, claiming there were spies among them.
Relocation centers were hurriedly built, principally in the western states, to house some 100,000 Issei, Japanese-born aliens, and Nisei, American-born U.S. citizens of Japanese parentage.
People suffered poor living conditions and had to live in internment until the war was over. No spies were ever found. Things began changing in the mid-60s. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed an order called the Hart-Cellar Act, which removed racist barriers to entry for many groups, including Asians. But that didn't end Asian American racism. Just like in the 19th century, in the 1980s, Asian Americans were again being blamed for taking away jobs, this time in the auto industry. The vilification escalated to the point that it resulted in the murder of 27-year-old Vincent Chin, who was killed by two white auto workers in Michigan. While the two men were ordered to pay a $3,000 fine, neither of them spent a single day in jail for the murder. Fast forward 20 years, and in 2003,
this week saw the galloping rise of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And as new cases emerge, quarantines expand, and the disease spreads to North America, the consequences are multiplying.
Asian Americans again faced harassment and were discriminated against with the rise of the SARS virus, which had originated in China. Almost another 20 years later, and we're now seeing a surge in violence against Asian Americans again, amid fear-mongering over the COVID-19 pandemic. Anti-Asian hate crimes like attacks on elders and vandalism increased by almost 150% in major cities in 2020 alone. Racism against the community spiked after Trump and other Republicans repeatedly called COVID-19 racist names like the Wuhan virus or Kung Flu.
Begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus.
But Trump and Republicans aren't the only ones to blame.
Take on directly the challenges posed by our prosperity, security, and democratic values by our most serious competitor, China.
Liberal leaders like Joe Biden have also been feeding into the rhetoric, with Cold War talk painting China as a threat to Americans. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Trump was right in taking a tougher approach to China. All of this rhetoric ultimately has a negative impact on the Asian American community in the United States, further casting them as the other.
Dismantling white supremacy means understanding the history of how we got here in the first place, rejecting U.S. imperialism and aggression towards other countries, rejecting increased policing and surveillance, and destroying the systems in place and dreaming up alternatives to community safety and how we are in relationship with one another.
And if there's anything that struck you or that you want to reflect back on, I'd be happy for folks to just, share how you're feeling, or if there's anything that.
Did you hear me?
Yes. Thanks, Hiroko. Go ahead.
This internment, the part is very hard for me, make me cry. It's here, not just California, but the Bainbridge and the Seattle, and the Seattle community I lived, yes, still suffered generational trauma because they, as a baby, their parents are interned because Japan attacked, and many people who are born here or never been to Japan and still just Japanese American, a good excuse to the, especially California, the Seattle area, many white people resented some Japanese success as a farmer, because they work so hard and on the land, so they didn't like that. So many Japanese American are interned, and I still talked with Japanese American who live in Seattle, and when I was in Seattle, the trauma I can feel, and it's really hard to watch. Just because of one race, you are imprisoned, basically. Someone's watching from the tower, and if you try to get out any reason, they shoot you. And that it's very hard to see for me to watch that section. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroko. I think just, hearing you share just reminds me of that, first piece around the diversity in our communities, that I think people who live through traumas like that, there's a few different ways that people go with that experience, right? One is kind of to really dive into this model minority idea and to be, to try to be kind of the perfect American, the one that can get along, the one that, is not going to cause trouble, because it's so painful to think about what would happen to me and my family if we caused trouble, right? And then there's others that go another direction that say, hey, this is not okay. We can't ever have this again, and organize and fight and resist alongside, people like you and Black Lives Matter and all of that. Our community's resilience looks all these different ways. But thank you, Hiroko, for sharing. And I'm so sorry that that was difficult to watch.
No. Many American, can you hear me?
Yes.
Many American people said that they didn't know that. So if that is true, they need to know. So it's great you show that part, okay?
Yeah, it's disturbing. It's disturbing to me. It seems like the last year and a half, I've been reading more stories of Asian people who are yelled at on the street or told to go home, even though they're, American citizens and were born here. So it seems like it's increased in the last couple of years to me, just from what I'm reading in the news. So.
Right. And I think that's definitely the case. And, having leadership at the top of our country, pretty much condone that, right? By the dehumanizing language, by, yeah, by acting in a way that doesn't protect, right? It's part of that work. Is there anyone else that would like to share?
My name is Ellen Newberg, and I've read not as extensively on prejudice against Asian Americans as against African Americans, but the history of prejudice against Asian Americans is very long and very, very deep. So as probably most of you know, many Chinese people were brought over to help build the railroads. And then there was the, I'm getting Chinese Exclusion Act. I kind of forgotten what that was about, but I do know that there was an act that forbid Asian Chinese men from having wives. And so Chinese women were not allowed to come to this country. And their hope was that they would come here and work and earn some money and go back to China. And then when they did, there's also a book called, I believe it's The Orchardist, and it's a story about I guess that was a Japanese family. Yeah, because first generation Japanese Isai were not allowed to own land. And so the story is about a Japanese family that has a wonderful orchard, but they can't buy it. And I think finally maybe their neighbor buys it or a son or something. But yeah, this has really long and deep roots. So
thank you so much. And yeah, you know, we have just a short time together today, but I hope that this conversation inspires people to look more into the history and to share more with each other, you know, things that surprise you and that you want, you know, your friends, your contacts, your children, your neighbors to know about. And I think time. This is another statement from the Seattle Asian American Film Festival. Anti-Asian violence also continues to be perpetuated in the forms of ongoing deportations of the Southeast Asian refugees, targeting of Asian massage parlors by police, xenophobic and Orientalist statements and policies from the government, and the lack of meaningful representation in leadership, politics, and media. The structural violence at the intersections of misogyny, racism, US imperialism, and militarism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. I found this really compelling as a statement. You know, I think a lot of times when there's violence against a community, people can think, oh, you know, the police are the answer, right? And as I'm sure you guys have been following Black Lives Matter work and you know, for Asian American communities, I think it was really important for us also this march to say, hey, you know what, for us, police are not the answer either. We don't want to be overly surveilled. You know, there's all of these stereotypes and assumptions about what happens in massage parlors. Sometimes there's police raids that happen in massage parlors that can lead to more violence for those workers. What we want is real solidarity. You know, what we want is for people to know our stories, to uplift our narratives, and to support the solutions that we seek. And, you know, the solutions that come from communities are often solutions that benefit everybody, right? Things like housing for everybody, food security for everybody, you know, healthcare for everybody, things like that. There's a second video that I wanted to share, you know, not 100% of this is necessarily kind of my opinion here, but I thought that it was interesting, especially in thinking about how the dehumanization of Asians and Asian Americans perpetuates violence. So I'm going to share, and I can't remember how long, but I may cut it off a little bit early just to keep us having some time to discuss.
We have to ask ourselves why this Atlanta shooting and this massive spike in anti-Asian hate crimes is happening, because there are a lot of simplistic explanations flying around. A lot of people are blaming Donald Trump and his rhetoric surrounding COVID-19. Some people are pointing out that the alleged shooter is one in a long list of young white male shooters. And it's like, sure, that's all real. And I'm sure we'll learn a lot more about the racist and sexist motives of this one individual, but we need to go a level deeper. Anti-Asian hate crimes have been happening in this country since before Donald Trump was born. So what is it about this particular moment that has so many people turning on Asians?
Ratcliffe called China, quote, the greatest threat to America today and the greatest threat to democracy and freedom worldwide since World War II.
Communist China is already within our borders.
If we don't set the rules, we in fact are going to find ourselves with China setting the rules.
China is a pariah state. China is conducting biological experiments on its soldiers to enhance their capabilities. We should give no quarter, Neil, to China. There should be nothing spared.
We're not going to let you destroy this country or our way of life. We've worked too hard and we fought too long to lose it to a Wuhan. That's what I said, a Wuhan virus.
Yeah, I think that might have something to do with it. Take a look at this graph. Unfavorable views of China are at a historic high. In fact, it's not even close. So this begs the question, what explains this massive spike in anti-China sentiment? Why the sudden spike in 2018? To put it simply, the United States is starting to realize that it's not going to be the world's undisputed superpower forever. And a shift in the world order is coming way sooner than they expected. China's economy is on track to overtake the US economy by 2028. Chinese companies now lead the world in many fields, and Chinese technology is matching, if not surpassing, US technology. This stands in stark contrast to where China was just 15 or 20 years ago, when a lot of Americans saw China as just a sweatshop, a docile and submissive country that dutifully made little toys and trinkets for American kids. American policymakers and companies thought China would be the world's sweatshop forever, but they were wrong. And now China's rise is threatening the formerly unchallenged dominance of US corporations. Okay, but what does this have to do with racist violence against Asians? Well, anytime the US ruling class is threatened, its typical response is to resort to or threaten violence. That's why Pentagon officials
I just wanted to pause here and just let folks know there's going to be some violent footage. So if you need to skip that for your own kind of sense of well-being, I just invite you to mute it for a moment. A little bit.
Both the Trump and Biden administrations say with the utmost clarity that the US is preparing for a massive confrontation with China. A huge percentage of US military forces are now pointing to or encircling China. And every good war starts with good, racist war propaganda. All of those stories about China stealing trade secrets and hacking your toaster, it's all part of that war propaganda. It's aimed at convincing you that China is an existential threat to you and your family. It's designed to dehumanize Chinese people, to portray them as obedient robots and fundamentally different and lesser than, which makes it much easier to justify going to war against them.
I think it's the polite thing to do before doing sex to me.
And this propaganda is clearly working. Just think back to that graph I showed you. These anti-Asian hate crimes are also proof that the propaganda is working. People are convinced that China is taking down the country, and they're attacking anyone who looks Chinese, even if they're Korean, Thai, or some other nationality. So you can't just go to war. You have to have a long buildup of propaganda to psychologically prepare the population. You can't be honest and say, hey, we just need a few $1 trillion and we need you to go kill innocent people and die so we can preserve the unrivaled position of Wall Street bankers. No, you have to create some lie that you're doing it to protect the American people or protect human rights. And you have to utterly dehumanize the enemy you intend to attack. This is how the drive to war always starts. You probably remember how the US went into an anti-Muslim frenzy after 9/11, and innocent Muslims, but also people who were mistaken for being Muslim, like Sikhs, were attacked, harassed, and spit on. This is what anti-Japanese propaganda looked like in World War II. And of course, Japanese Americans, many of whom had lived their whole lives in the United States, were forced into camps and falsely incarcerated during this time. that racism at home is a necessary component to waging war abroad, which proves that imperialism is really the ultimate anti-Asian hate crime.
I'm gonna pause there. Just mostly in keeping track of time, this video does go on and it describes, more atrocities that the US committed in Asia and what you're seeing. Maybe I'll go to the next slide. I actually don't want to pause on this slide.
We have to ask ourselves why.
There's a lot of war atrocities that go on in that video, some in Vietnam, some in the Philippines, but it goes on, some in Korea, and he talks about just, this way that we have to dehumanize each other in order to perform genocide, right? And we as humans, as human beings, are wired to be kind, are wired to be compassionate, are wired to be social and to take care of one another. And we have to undo that wiring in order to perform these acts, right? So let's take a breath here. And if anyone wants to share, I just invite you to share kind of your responses or your thoughts.
Yeah, well,
Go ahead. Well, I think it's amazing because I didn't think about that as part of the plan to get us ready for war. Because I have noticed all this anti-Asian thing, and I did wonder about the trade things. And of course, it's obvious that that there's a lot of research going on, and an awful lot of the research papers that are published in in English and in American journals, scientific journals, an awful lot of them have Chinese authors now. So I didn't put the two together until this film, that it's getting us, that they're jealous of China right now.
Well, I have a question about this. Joanne, what is the reasonable approach to take to China when you consider what the Chinese government is doing to its own people, and the challenge actually that the Chinese pose to the rest of the world? They're not necessarily a benign government, and so I think it behooves our government to say things like that. I mean, there's a necessity to separate the government of China from the people.
Yeah, yeah.
I certainly think that disrespecting the people is an outrage. However, I certainly also oppose some of the things the Chinese government is doing. And I think we need to be able to make that distinction.
Right. And, I think as moral people, we have to look at that, right? We have to look at that. And at the same time as like critical social justice activists in this world, we have to look at, the way that our own empathy and our own care can be manipulated, because that's kind of what we saw first in Afghanistan too, right? Was all of a sudden the US cares so much about the women of Afghanistan. We have to save Afghanistan. And I personally, I'll just say for myself, I was swept up in that. It's very hard when you see a human rights challenge and you are a caring person to say, we're not going to touch that. We're not going to do anything with that, right? You want to empathize. You want to go there. You want to do the right thing.
Right.
I think what the United States has to do is go from that place of humility, right? To say, you know what, that's wrong and we are wrong, right? There's so many people we don't take care of in our own borders. We need to set the right example for humanity rather than bullying towards what we want in the world, right? We have to do the right thing at home first.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand that moral dilemma, right? It's so painful to know something happening is wrong in the world and to to have to pause and to think about what is happening here. What are people trying to make me okay with for the long term here?
There's also very strong economic ties and trade ties between China and the US, between China and US companies. And so we are really intimately connected in that way. And as I understand it, the Chinese also own a great deal of our debt, the US debt. So if they ever called wanted that debt to be paid back, we'd be in a big trouble as a nation. So there are really big issues at work here. And I think it's very hard for the government to speak in a way that is nuanced enough, that addresses the challenges, but also respects the people.
Yeah.
And in terms of introducing this video, there's a little bit of a conspiracy feeling here, right? And when I first saw it, I wasn't 100% on board, but I do think the historical perspective is really interesting. The historical piece around the ways that we continue to dehumanize each other in order to make the case that, it's okay to incarcerate people, it's okay to intern people, it's okay to go to war with people, these things that are actually against our deep humanity and our care, that it starts with this dehumanizing. And that we see that in the United States through these hate crimes, through, the ways that we set each other apart to say, oh, you're not human, you're not worth your well-being. Maybe one more comment.
I'm just going to say, how there's a saying, follow the money. And that's not such a bad thing to think about. I had forgotten it also, and I was taken up, just like you say, I seem to be very gullible. So whenever people tell me there's an enemy, I say, oh yeah, there's an enemy. But then you really think, in the past, almost always it's been about money. They tell you an enemy is a person who's really going to just, that is winning economically.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, I was wondering, Joanne, as far as the anti-Asian violence in the US and the Puget Sound area, is there any particular group or organization that somebody that's concerned about that, like myself, and I'm sure very many others here, could support or even donate or support financially, that is sort of combating, or maybe combating the violence, or in educating people maybe, or some way kind of working against it? I know that, like, there's an ACLU, I realize, and kind of mainstream organizations like that, but I was wondering if there's any other you can think, that comes to mind.
Thanks, Jerry. That's a perfect segue. So we're going towards solutions, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but this definitely ask what your community needs right now. And then in terms of organizations, here are a few that I really adore. Of course, API Chaya is at the top of my list. That's my home base. And API Chaya works with survivors of violence, including hate crimes. The Massage Parlor Outreach Project group is the one that put that vigil on in March, and organized in March, and I think it happened in April. And they're a grassroots formation. You can look on their Instagram and their Facebook for ways to connect or to donate. The Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, you probably have heard of them. They're a group of concerned attorneys, and they support people who are fighting deportations. They're amazing. I highly recommend, getting to know them if you don't already. And then other groups in the Seattle area that have a really great presence are the Asian Counseling and Referral Service, International Community Health Service. Gabriela USA was one of my home base organizations before. They're an anti-imperialist organization. Parasol is actually a really interesting organization. They're a grassroots formation that's mostly Chinese people. And they're a combination of anti-imperialist, love their homeland, love their culture, hate the dehumanizing parts of what the government is doing, And then of course, Black Lives Matter. And we keep including Black Lives Matter because we're here for solidarity. We understand that, you know, white supremacy impacts all of us, and that the solutions we create, we have to create together. So yeah, if anyone wants more information about these organizations, I'm happy to share the slide deck. I saw someone take a photo, but I'm happy to share the slide deck, and I'm happy to be asked questions after this about the organizations too. And then maybe if folks are willing to stay a couple minutes, I'd love to hear, you know, if there's anything that you're inspired to do, and yeah, if there's a direction that you're hoping to go from here.
I didn't jot it down. What was the name of the video we just watched? Is it on the internet?
I can share my whole slide deck with the group afterwards, and then the videos are embedded, so you won't have a hard time finding.
Okay, that's all right.
And Jerry, I'll just send them to you if that's okay.
What's that? Oh, sure. Yeah. Jill, send them to me through email or?
Great. Yes.
Oh, okay. Then I can just send them to
anybody who wants one can email to Jerry and he will respond.
So in this,
it's hard to get the list of the people who are.
Okay, thank you.
So in this discussion, we quite naturally start from our, from our own place. But do you suppose there, as I do, that there are many people in China who, much of the world views the Chinese as aggressive, in other words, imperialistic. So they are themselves are imperialistic towards Africa, towards the rest of Asia, and as the Japanese were in pre-World War II, and as some Americans felt the Japanese were in their economic boom of the 70s and 80s, where they appeared to be on the road to be going to be the world's leading economy. So, so I think, I guess what I'm implying is probably if we want to avoid war, we have to find peaceful allies in the populations of our enemies, if we want to call them enemies, or our opponents, or the other side.
Right, and I think that's why Parasol is so interesting, because they have the perspective of being anti-imperialist, not just in terms of the US, not being an imperialist power, but also China not being an imperialist aggressor, that they're a human rights-based organization. And I think if folks would like to connect with them, they're so lovely.
And I think programs like the Rotary Youth Exchange, it's on hold right now because of COVID, but like I mentioned, we had two Asian young women who stayed with us, and then they stayed with the other families as well. And we've gotten to know their families. And when Alan's sister was a junior in high school, there was a Christian Japanese girl that went to Custer, South Dakota. And, that friendship has been maintained all these years. And, people-to-people programs, I think, are really important because, you just can't imagine, you get to know people and they're friends and they're wonderful people. Like the Umaharas are probably one of the most perfect families in the world. Like they're so loving and so good with their kids and grandkids. They're just, wonderful people. And more of that needs to happen. So we know they're not just, evil competitors.
It was quite interesting when we had the Asian, or when we had the Taiwanese girl. And she, of course, her first language was Mandarin. And
we thought she was Chinese.
We grew up thinking of that, of them as Chinese, but she did not like to be called Chinese. She wanted to be called Taiwanese, and she had to set us straight. And of course, Taiwan is under, it's at the heart of militaristic potential conflicts between the United States and China, if it happens, it almost for certain will start with Taiwan.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what we said something, and she's just this little person and pretty meek and mild most of the time, but all of a sudden she's, I am not Chinese. I am Taiwanese. Okay.
I mean, I think that speaks to, the diversity, right? That when we have these dehumanizing campaigns, it seeks to flatten people, right? It seeks to flatten people into kind of one image of who they are, what they believe, the ways that they're different from us. And the more that we connect on like a true level, on a relational level, and hear each other and see each other, the more that we understand kind of what it means to be human together, right? And what it means to fight for peace and freedom together.
So we went to China on a Habitat for Humanity's build project. We were there for 2 weeks with the project and then a week afterwards. It was very interesting because we spent almost all of our time with actually quite poor people in China, or with quite middle-class people who were employees of Habitat for Humanity China. And so we had lots of interactions with those people. It happened to be right at the very time, when we arrived in Beijing, it was the weekend that President Xi Jinping was being, whatever you want to say, coronated or inaugurated or whatever it was. Anyway, he was made to be the prime leader during that period of time when we were in Beijing.
Yeah, Tiananmen Square was closed. You could not go near there because the ceremonies were happening in a government building near it, and you were not allowed. I suppose, for crowd control or riot control, but no one was allowed in that area.
Well, I was going to say 2 things. From the Vietnamese point of view, but mostly the Chinese, they have that poem, 1,000 Years of Domination by the Chinese. And the Chinese also, during my lifetime, when they were in Saigon, they considered themselves much better than the Vietnamese. So there's a real prejudice. The Vietnamese don't like the Chinese, but the Chinese think they're way better than the Vietnamese, and then also I've been in Tibet, and the Chinese were not like there either. And they really do control that. They control the Tibetan access to a lot of things. So yeah, it's really complicated, isn't it?
So basically, if we were in China, we would be worried about, and we were otherwise the same, we'd be worried about our government, if we were Chinese, being too racist. Our society being too racist, just as we're worried about our own society here being too racist.
Yeah, and then towards the Muslims too in China.
As we close up, I do think it's good to just come back to this place of what can we do, right? What are we capable of, and just locating our own capacity, our own sense of place, right? We are, I'm assuming everyone here in Washington State today, and and that as things move forward, we have an opportunity to see, will our country make this move towards war? Will our country make this move towards further dehumanization? And then how can we be prepared? How can we be ready for, being aware of the ways that our empathy is being used against us? How can we be aware of, maintaining our own dignity, our own humanity, our own ability to see the complexity, right? That, China does not always do the right thing. Does it mean that we should annihilate them? Does it mean that we should annihilate the population, right? Probably not. Does it mean that we should go to war? Probably not, right? But to just continue to inspire ourselves, our friends, our nation, to do the right thing, right? To do the right thing at home and to do the right thing abroad. If you get the slide deck, if you ask for the set from Jerry, you'll get another little video present, which is you know, just some footage of some protesting that happened for Stop AAPI Hate, where we got to see just really beautiful moments of Black and Asian solidarity. And of course of white folks joining in those marches too, and being part of that voice for justice and for peace and for dignity and compassion. And if folks would like to stay in touch with me, I invite you to. So you're welcome to take down my email if you like. It's jowann@gmail.com. There's just so many Joannes in the world. So this was the shortest way to get my own name. jowann@gmail.com. And I'm happy to just be in touch and yeah, for you to share any further thoughts or questions. And just wanted to thank you again for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you, Joanne. It's such a crucial topic, and I know it's just the beginning. I mean, I feel like I got so much to learn still, and this sort of stimulated me to continue studying and learning. And I just so much, and thank you, Hiroko, for for bringing Joanne to us. So thank you.